Welcome back to Cards and Comics. Today I've got a video which I've thought about, tried to record many times. And the reason why it's hard for me is because it's covering a period, this video is going to cover a period of collecting, which I'm not an expert on. In fact, I'm going to cover some things today in which I'm more of a, a viewer or someone who observed after the fact some of these issues or some of these events, right? And the point of the video is really about the idea that there's a period of collecting, a time period, I want to say late 80s to mid 90s, where a lot of things happened in the hobby very quickly. And that evolution, I don't think has really been documented very well in the hobby. And I think, there's a lot of things out there that could be done to kind of tell the stories of that time period, right? Now, to do that, I'm gonna talk about a friend of the channel. His name is Rock. He wants to remain anonymous. He's got a great collection, been a great friend and someone who, I enjoy talking to, and I want to share some of his stories. And I'm trying to figure out a way to share more of his stories directly from him, not me interpreting what he is saying, because I'd rather you hear from him. But he doesn't want to be on the channel for a lot of reasons in terms of showing who he is and just make an appearance. So maybe it'll just be a recording of him, to talk about things that he knows about, because he is highly knowledgeable about things that, again, I didn't really have a lot of experience firsthand, and I'll walk, kind of through that. And I also want to kind of compare and contrast my experience with Marshall Fogel, with dealers who were, very active in that time period, and, with my friend Rock, and just that time period of the hobby, right? Now, before I get into that, I want to give just a quick update on the channel and what's going on. In July, I'm going to hit 3 years on YouTube. I'm also approaching 1,000 subscribers, so I don't ask for people to like and subscribe to my channel. It's just something I've never really done, and I feel weird about it. But I would think it would be kind of cool to get to 1,000 subscribers, just from a ego perspective. I don't need to monetize the channel. This isn't going to be my living for sure. So don't feel like this is about me wanting to run ads. It's just, after 3 years, it'd be great to hit 1,000 subscribers, just from a channel ego perspective. Other than that, please continue to interact with me in the channel. Go to my Instagram, which should be listed below, and check me out there. There's a lot of things that happen there before they go on the channel, such as my grade reveals for PSA cards. Sometimes I post things I break, like the 1998 Bowman's Best Griffey that I pulled. So I do post there quite a bit as well. So and then the Nationals coming up. I plan on being there. I've got tickets. I've got a hotel. So I plan to be there Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. That's the time period I set aside to be there. I got to get plane tickets and everything. So, that's still happening. But that's the plan, is to be there those 3 days. So if you're going to the National, let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk to anyone who, watches my videos or just wants to talk about cards and comic books and things that I collect, you collect. I would love to just talk and, go to the trade nights and have fun. The National itself is just a big party for collectors. Going back to the video itself. So if you go to this Sports Collectors Digest article that came out, I think last year, I think it's a 2022 article. Let's see if I get a date here. Yeah, June 8th, 2022. So it's literally a year ago. It's a really good article. But what I want to talk about is the time period here. So when he goes into the how it all started, he talks about 1989. So I think a lot of people that's going to be surprising. I think a lot of people would view like that these guys started in like these massive collectors all started like in the 70s or early 80s and got in really early in ground floor, and that's not really the case. For a lot of these guys, these big time collectors. And the reason why I want to talk about Marshall versus Rock is that again, one of them is a very public collector. The other one is a private collector who doesn't really share what he has or is very public about it. Unless you know him, unless you go to his where he lives, you won't really see his collection. And I think that's a big difference between that collecting style. But they share a very similar trait, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What I think their trait is that they share together. But I like this story where he talks about being in Chicago and going to the National Convention by coincidence. I'm not sure that's really true, but it's a good story. And then he talked about, like buying his first Mickey Mantle card, and he got screwed on that one because it was trimmed, 53 Topps Mantle. So it's a good story because it really talks about the beginning of PSA, which was in 1991, and all that. And then there's some really interesting tidbits in here about Marshall and what he was doing at that time. One of them that I thought was very interesting was how he had this vision of collecting mantles, and how he got into the that side of the hobby really heavy. But there's some things he says here that's just really odd to me as well. Like, first of all, he talks about he educated himself, read books and all that, which is great. But he talks about Al Rosen and Josh Evans, being these kind of great aggressive collectors, and how he viewed them as kind of like the founding fathers of especially Al Rosen, Mr. Mint, a founding figure in the development of modern collecting. And I think it's an interesting take because not a lot of people, I think, have viewed him that way. He talks about going to Sotheby's auctions and this all these things happening because it's leading up to the idea of this 52 Topps mantle that he bought, right? So he's getting heavy into the hobby in 91. PSA is just starting, and he talks about buying uniforms, and so he was into different things, right? The one thing I want to talk about is hobby figures that are always around. So the one thing that was interesting to me is I did not know this, is that he got the mantle, or the mantle was owned by Mark Murphy's dad. And so for people who don't know who Mark Murphy is, Mark Murphy was the Wax Pack Kid or something like that. He sold a lot of cards through like ads and publications. And Mark Murphy was active for a long time in the hobby when I was younger. But I knew him as kind of the wax pack guy. You could buy wax packs or cello packs with stars on the front. And he had like a mystery fire in his warehouse, burned down his inventory, and there was some things around that. But his claim to fame was, I think, the grocery store, the Christmas packs, those holiday packs. A lot of them came from him. Whether he created them or he just found them or whatever, I don't know. But a lot of them were sold by him, and that's sort of the Mark Murphy story. But his dad was a collector, and it had the 52 mantle in a set that ended up being the PSA 10. He talks about, David Hall, who founded PSA, or Collectors Universe, which owns PSA, and how he had a collection. And it's just, these hobby stories are so intertwined. Like these people, Mark Murphy, David Hall, Al Rosen, are so intertwined. And, when that mantle came up for sale, there was, the idea before that, though, that to me is also very interesting, is that he told Marshall Fogel that, they wanted him to be the poster boy and that he would grade all of his cards for free. And I think that is interesting. Like, right? That, like a hobby whale like Marshall got all his cards graded for free. Um, that's just that's just something that I didn't realize. I had heard stories where PSA would fly graders out to people's houses, right, to grade cards on site, at a whale's place, right, so they didn't have to send their cards in, that kind of stuff. So, the idea that they graded his cards for free is interesting, but it was early on. This is early adapting, and I think the big story here and how it ties into what I'm going to talk about with Rock is like they kind of had a vision about the future of the hobby and the idea of graded cards being the currency of the hobby, and how high end collecting was going to be, sort of where everyone was going to make a lot of, that's where the money was going to go, right? And he talks about buying the Mano for $120,000, right? So that was, very, very interesting, because he talks about how people were mad at him. Other dealers, other collectors were like, you're, setting a benchmark, that you're creating a crazy comp that we would call it today. So yeah, it's just a very interesting that now it's one of the 3 PSA 10s, and he thinks his is the most pristine. It's got the stupid Mike Baker sticker, so on and on, right? So that's just, but Marshall, has always been sort of this guy ingrained with the hobby, let's say the in crowd, right? And so people knew who he was, but, the thing about it is that, he was very heavy into PSA graded cards, and then later on bats and uniforms and things like that. So when I contrast his style of collecting, which is a lot of high end and a lot of things that were, best of the best, but he also paid, crazy amounts compared to what the comps were at the time. So he was overpaying for cards because of condition and sort of like this idea of a future value that he thought that was there. Now my buddy Rock, he has a different take. And so, as I get over here into sort of this idea of, the differences in collecting, where I think something like a PSA set registry and having the best collection was sort of helping drive someone like a Marshall Fogel, because he was competitive in trying to get the best. My buddy, Rock, when I talked to him about his collection, which is a massive, crazy, cool collection, he was driven by something else. And it was very different when I talked to him. What was, his thing was about getting a good deal and having, and he didn't care about volume, meaning that he would have 5 of the same card, 10 of the same card, 100 of the same card, as long as it was in the condition and the price range he wanted. And to him, the competition wasn't always having the greatest, the best of the best. It was getting the card in the condition they wanted for the price he wanted. And that was how he, was made it a game for himself. So that's something I wanted to really point out, is that people who have let's say the money to buy whatever they want, to just go out and spend whatever, that's not very fun, and that's not very challenging. So to make the hobby fun, you have to make it challenging. You can't just, buy everything and then be done in 2 weeks, right? and you get 4 million packages show up at your door and you're done as a collector, right? So people like, Rock, and, who's doing it based on kind of a value equation that he's created to try to challenge himself, versus Marshall, who's trying to get the best version of that card, even if it's in the same grade, and challenging him to be, really, really high on the either the set registries or just, known to have the best copies. That's competition. That's like internal themselves and how they view their collection to make it more challenging. And I think that's just different, because if you were to take a collector today, like someone like me, or someone who just has a, I say normal collection, but compared to like a Vogel or even or my buddy Rock. I mean, like like we're mere mortals to these people, right? They're kind of like superhero collectors. Um, and you say you had $1 million to buy cards. I think we would all run out of steam at some point. Um, it's like the movie Brewster's Millions. Like you you can spend money, spend money, spend money, get cards after card, and then think about unloading all that money, getting all those cards, unpacking the packages, sorting everything. At some point, you're going to try to like make sense of it all. You're going to be like, I'm just buying everything. I got to make it. I got to start pitting criteria here. Like, what am I buying? Why am I buying it? Like, what am I getting here? Am I just a hoarder? Am I just going to just buy stuff to buy stuff, right? That is what I think happens with people who even have a ton of money. They just don't go out and just spend whatever spend whatever they want, right? Sometimes I'm sure they get FOMO, buy something that looks cool, but I think they're more disciplined than just going out and spending whatever. And I think I had a misconception when I was building my collection, when I was just starting out, that because you are jealous of people who can just go out and drop whatever they want on a card. And I mentioned a lot of times the 68 3D Clemente, which is kind of like the superstar showpiece piece of any Clemente collection. I could never have enough money at any one point in time to get it whenever it came up for sale, and I kind of gave up on it and almost quit collecting, almost sold my entire Clemente collection because of it, because of that one card. And so yeah, I was at one point very jealous of people who had the ability just to go out and buy that card when it came up because they had the resources, right? And so I felt like, well, if you were that wealthy and had all this money, then collecting isn't a challenge. Like, why do we even care about Marshall's collection? Because all he did was spend a bunch of money. And now that I've looked at how he operated, how my buddy Rock operated, it was a challenge. It was creative. It was something that was built not by just spending a bunch of money, but actually having a plan and an execution to it that you have to kind of applaud. And I think I feel bad now that I think about that they were just rich, so they just did what they wanted. No, after talking to multiple people who are kind of these mega collectors, they all had plans. They all had things that they were limiting themselves on or challenging themselves on. So I think it's a myth that these people who build these giant collections are just like doing it just out there spending money left and right and don't care what they're buying and all this stuff. They care a lot. And that's the one thing I also was very impressed by was you know Rock, he you know he knows so much about cards, and he cares a lot about the images and what they look like, and the memories, and it's just like they're just like us, like how we look at cards. It doesn't change that feeling into how a collector collects, right? The other thing I want to talk about is sort of, and we talked about sort of this time period, right? Um, just sitting down and having a conversation about Rock. He's bringing up things that I don't really have experience with, right? And one of them is, I really didn't start collecting graded cards until 1997. I didn't really go to big card shows until that time period between 97 and 2001 is really when I started going to nationals and Chicago shows. So PSA again started in 91. Rock, Marshall, those guys started earlier than that. So I wasn't at the ground floor. I was sort of that generation two, let's call it that. I wasn't the first adopter generation. I wasn't pre PSA, going to shows, big shows. I was going to local shows and doing things in a very micro scale, right? And he started talking to me about Gloria, Rothstein, about the East Coast National, about the dealers, Al Rosen, and things that he experienced that I've never experienced. For one thing, I grew up in Oklahoma, so I didn't know any of those people, like the New York City comic and sports card scene, because Rock collects comic books as well. In fact, he if you go to my Instagram, you'll see some really awesome Golden Age books there that he sold for a friend. They're going to be in Heritage. It's an amazing collection. Some big books. Like, I mean, I think the books I showed on my Instagram is a fraction of the books that he has. They're like $250,000 in value, just the ones I showed. So they were huge books. And so, he's a comic book guy, he's a card guy, but I didn't know any of this stuff. Like, and his stories are just insane. Like, he was telling me about, the um, all right, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, he was telling me about things like the 69 decals from Topps, and how that he went to shows in the 80s and 90s where dealers had rolls of the decals because Topps didn't pack them out in time, and they were delayed in shipping. And so someone bought the whole rolls of the decals. They came in a roll, and you could buy them by the foot. And that's why he was like, they're not really rare, because you could just buy 2 feet of them, and you could get the Reggie Jackson, the Pete Rose, if you were lucky. The guy just reeled off 2 or 3 feet at a time and sold it to you by the foot. That's stuff that you never hear about unless you were there, unless you were in that time period. I mentioned Gloria Rothstein because that's someone I never ever met, didn't know about, but like Dr. James Beckett did a whole tribute to her. And she started the East Coast National, right? Which just started up again. But she was a founder of that time period of shows, of having a show on the East Coast that was, kind of like the National in size. So those things are stuff I don't know about. All right, that's something that I just don't have a lot of experience with. And it's great talking to Rock and to hear his stories about stuff like that. Hearing him talk about Al Rosen and hearing him talk about, card collecting in those days is a lot of fun. And, we just don't have those stories, I think, collected in a way like an anthology of folks, that lived that time period. And I mean, you got the Mr. Mint book, but it's like very grandizing. It would be great to have a book kind of like, Our Band Could Be Your Life, where it's someone who goes through all these cast of characters and really brings them all together in this big circle, because the hobby was small back then and it's still small today. The cast of characters are all intermingled and they all know each other. And again, I'm sitting in that Generation 2 collector where I've heard of these people, but they weren't people either I bought from or socialized with, because they were kind of getting out, or they were in a different level. It's like King Golden, right? I'm not a big King Golden fan, and I definitely bought Scoreboard back in the day, but I've never interacted with King Golden, right? But like, Rock, Marshall, those guys have interacted with these folks, have bought directly from these folks. Know the owners of Heritage Auctions personally. It's a different level, right? And I think that is very interesting. I'd love to hear more stories. So I think I'm going to go and try to get him to do an interview where we just talk about hobby stories, and his experience of these shows and setting up and doing deals and what it was like to be a dealer in those days, to be a collector in those days. Because I feel like that time period again is just not well documented, but I think it's the foundational part of the hobby because Marshall Fogel says in this article, he talks about during this auction at Sotheby's, he says, Maestro and Al Rosen, Mr. Mint, who he alluded to as the father of the hobby. I think that is definitely a more credit than, or more of a title than I've heard anyone give Mr. Mint before. But he says the two deserve the biggest credit from taking this from a hobby to a collectible asset. So that's a very interesting take, and I think that I would like to explore that a lot more, honestly, because that, how did he view it before and after, and what do they do besides auction houses and for Mr. Mint, going around buying cards? There had to be more to it than that. So that's a very interesting take. So let me know in the comments if what you think about, would you like to hear stories from this time period? Have Rock on the channel in some format. He's obviously not going to be on like a normal video interview, but I think I could maybe record his voice or record an interview and just kind of edit it down and play kind of stories from that time period. Let me know if that's interesting for you guys. I think he's a wealth of knowledge, but it's definitely from a time period where it created the foundation for the modern hobby. And I think without these folks who kind of pioneered this and was also burned heavily, Marshall talks about in this video, and Rock has talked about too, is like getting trim cards and having to go find dealers and getting their money back and suing people. And it's always been this sort of challenge in this hobby to stay in it and not get screwed. So I think those stories are important as well. So there it is, guys. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.